Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to announce the last session. Every good thing has to come to an end, and certainly this has been a very good 2 days, and it is my pleasure to chair this session. And I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Csilla Gábor, who is an external member and represents the first section of the Academy of Sciences, which is actually the literature and literary sciences section. And the title of her talk is on the international embeddedness of early modern Hungarian literature, theoretical consideration and a case study. Csilla, please.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to speak in front of you. I will speak in Hungarian, but I have my presentation in English so that those who do not understand Hungarian can also follow. Tisztelt elnök úr, tisztelt megjelentek! Az előadásom címe magyarul a kora-újkori magyarországi irodalom nemzetközi beágyazottságáról. Elvi megfontolások és egy esettanulmány. Néhány bevezető gondolat az interkulturális kommunikációról. Az utóbbi évtizedek hazai és nemzetközi irodalomtudományi kutatásaiban felbukkanó újszerű szempont a transznacionalitásé. Igaz, hogy az először Amerikában használt fogalom és szemléletmód megjelenése elsősorban a globalizációval és migrációval, illetőleg többnyelvű régiók mai kulturális kölcsönkapcsolatainak működési stratégiáival, az amerikai úgynevezett nemzeti identitás alakulásának dilemmáival függ össze. Vannak azonban olyan megfontolások, amelyek, ha körültekintően alkalmazzuk azokat, tájainkon és korábbi korszakok kutatásaiban is termékenyek, és amelyek a széles körben használt világirodalom fogalomnak egy tágasabb, talán kevésbé hierarchizált alternatívái lehetnek. Ha a világirodalmi műveknek azokat nevezzük, amelyek keletkezésük kulturális kontextusán kívül is élnek, akár eredeti nyelven, akár fordításban, amint ezt a problémakör ikonikus tekintélye David Damrosch megállapítja, akkor a műfordítás miben léte és metodológiája sajátosan felértékelődik, mert nem csupán szövegek egyik nyelvből a másikba való átültetéséről fog szólni, hanem nyelv és gondolkodás viszonyának komplexitását is tekintetbe veszi. Továbbá a kultúrák közötti átjárást és találkozást, a térben és időben történő tájékozódást. Bizonyos művek hálózatos összekapcsolódásának belátása révén pedig azok kulturális, közösségi, nemzeti, stb. Beágyazottsága is újra keretezhetővé válik. A fordítás újfajta életet ad egy-egy műnek. Átértékelődhetnek és dinamikussá válhatnak például olyan bináris oppozíciók, mint centrum és periféria, nemzet és diaszpóra, globális és lokális, fordítások esetében pedig az eredeti és a másolat viszonya. Mindez azért lehet releváns, immár a vizsgált időszakra, a magyar kora-újkorra koncentrálva, mert a megszokott, sokszor reflexió nélkül elfogadott irodalomtudományi, tágabban kulturális közbeszéd szinte mentegetőzve a korszakot a nyugat-európai folyamatok megkésett recepciójának horizontjában szemlélve, és így valamiféle habituális, kisebbrendűségi érzést sugallva beszélt sokáig éppen a régi korok irodalom és művelődés történeti sajátosságairól, ezen belül fordításairól és fordítói teljesítményeiről. A kritika jogos és érvényes, a megkésettség és a recepció tudomásul vétele mellett azonban vannak további megfontolásra érdemes szempontok is, ezekre tekintünk rá röviden. Egy kis emlékeztető, recepció, fordítás és újraalkotás, tartalmi és adaptációs kérdések. Itt azt szeretném megjegyezni, hogy sokkal tágabb az a forrásanyag, amiről beszélni lehetne. Én most kizárólag a mai értelemben is szépirodalomként is recipiálható műfajokra és szövegformákra fogok koncentrálni ettől arra felé. Az epikus énekek sorában, amelyek a magyar reneszánsz és reformációs közegben reprezentatív szövegeknek számítanak, kiemelkednek a jobbára tragikus véget ért szerelmi történeteket költői és lélektani érzékkel elbeszélő úgynevezett szép históriák, amelyek köztudottan az európai irodalom népszerű műveit közvetítik, sokszor több és többféle nyomtatott kiadás révén, akár áttételeken keresztül a magyar befogadók felé. Néhány példa a teljesség igénye nélkül. A dián látható Istvánffy Pál által készített Historia Regis Voltaire Boccaccio Decameronjának a Griseldis című 100. novelláját szabja át versbe, ám Petrarca latin átdolgozásának felhasználásával. Szintén Boccaccio novellát, a 31-et ülteti át verses formában a későbbi unitárius püspök Enyedi György Historia Elegantissimája, avagy Gismunda és Giscardus históriája. Persze ezúttal is egy humanista ízlés szerint átdolgozott, némiképp antikizáló, ugyancsak verses latin munka alapján. Ez idősebb Filippo Beroaldo Fabula Tancredi ex Boccaccio in Latinum versa című disztihonos poémája. Hasonlót mondhatunk az ismeretlen szerzőtől származó, a kolofon alapján pataki névtelennek elkeresztelt Euryalus és Lucréciáról, amely Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, a későbbi II. Pius pápa Historia de Duobus Amantibus című terjedelmes novelláját, akár regénynek is nevezhetnénk ezt a szöveget, magyarítja verses formában. Ha e kiadványok korabeli európai megfelelőit gyors kereséssel számba vesszük, hasonló, ha nem is teljesen azonos jelenségeket figyelhetünk meg. Voltaire és Griseldis története Chaucer Canterbury meséibe is belekerült, további angol feldolgozásai a 17. század elejéről valók. Francia nyelven a 14. században 20-nál több fordítása született, és ezek között is akad olyan, amely Petrarca változatát veszi alapul. Vannak továbbá német és lengyel átdolgozások is a 15. és 16. századból. Gismunda és Giscardus történetének is ismeretesek 15-16. századi német, spanyol, angol, francia, cseh, prózai, verses, sőt dramatikus feldolgozásai, és persze a fordítások ezekben az esetekben sem mindig készülnek közvetlenül a Boccaccio szövegből, hanem átdolgozások átdolgozásai. Ahogyan az Euryalus történet is bejárta Európát a legkülönfélébb nemzeti nyelvű, nyelvenként olykor több fordításokban, adaptációkban. Már ebből a jószerével csak utaló szavakra szorítkozó áttekintésből is felsejlik talán, hogy az egyes történetek fordításai, átdolgozásai és kiadásai szövevényes, szöveghagyományozódási mintázatokat mutatnak. Nem biztos, hogy ezek minden részletét fel lehet deríteni, ez lehet nem is érdemes, azt azonban meg lehet állapítani, hogy az ilyen tételek valamilyen közös európai olvasáskultúra, ha nem túl nagy szó, irodalmi tudat, egyfajta kulturális interkonnektivitás meglétét igazolják, amit akár hálózatosan is elgondolhatunk. Erre a megközelítésmódra jótékonyan erősít rá egy nyugat-európai kutatás. Ebben nagy örömömre magam is részt veszek. Ennek egyik eredménye egy a kora újkori Európában legnépszerűbbnek tartott 10 fiktív elbeszélést vagy epikus gyűjteményt vizsgáló tanulmánykötet, amely irodalom és könyvtörténeti perspektívát alkalmaz, a szövegeknek a különféle nyelveken történő tér- és időbeli terjedésére figyel különösen, anélkül, hogy valamely nyelvet prioritizálná, és talán ez az újdonsága. Továbbá azt is rögzíti, ahogyan ezeket fordították, adaptálták, az olvasók értelmezését irányítani kívánó paratextusokkal, előszavakkal és utószavakkal látták el, esetenként egyik műformából a másikba konvertálták. A szerkesztők választásának szempontjai között a népszerűség mellett az egyszerre szórakoztató és épületes jelleg emelkedik ki. Nem csupán a mai, hanem a korabeli befogadó szempontjait figyelembe véve. A kötet bevezetőjének, mármint a tanulmánykötet bevezetőjének egy határozott mondata, hogy mivel e szövegek nem csupán egy-két nyelven terjedtek el, hanem évszázadokon át Európa szerte forgalomban voltak, előmozdították egy kora-újkori összeurópai irodalmi identitás kialakítását, többjüknek pedig már középkori kéziratos szöveghagyományozódása is nyomon követhető. A 10 műből 6-nak ismerjük kora-újkori magyar kiadását vagy kiadásait, olykor akár kétféle változatban is, mint amilyen az Ezopusz fabulák, ugye ezek az állatmesék, ezek közismertek mindannyiunk számára ma is, vagy a ponciánus történet, ez lehet, hogy nem annyira közismert, de erről majd szó lesz kicsit később. A Top 10 Fictional Narratives tanulmányai számolnak a soron levő művek magyar változataival, és apróbb kihagyásokat leszámítva korrekt bibliográfiai leírásokat adnak róluk, beleértve a címiratok angolra fordítását is. A szövegekhez nyilvánvalóan nem mennek közel, egyik nyelv esetében sem amúgy, hiszen céljuk, hogy a terjedés több évszázados útvonalait, magát a szövegforgalmat lekövessék. Ennek során olyan vizuális elemeket is szemügyre vesznek, mint a címlapok díszítése és elrendezése, a könyvekben esetlegesen található metszetek, vagy a szövegek tagolása, ami a használatra, az olvasóktól elvárt értelmezés irányára vonatkozóan adhat eligazítást. A korpusz áttekintése azután több szálon is összekapcsolja a különféle nyelveken elérhető anyagot. A magukat sokszor históriaként megnevező könyvek valamiképpen mind hozott anyagból dolgoznak, azaz fordítások. Persze nem a szó mai műfordítás vagy szakfordítás értelmében. Hogy az adott mű egy másik nyelven már elérhető, az a korabeli felfogás szerint tekintélyt biztosít az olvasnivalónak. Ezt gyakorta hangsúlyozzák például az olvasókhoz intézett előszavak. Ami más nyelven már elérhető, ami más nyelven keletkezett, az régi, és ez értékgarancia. Újdonságát ugyanakkor, hiszen ennek hangsúlyozása is fontos, a fordított mi volt, esetleg az újrafordítás bejelentése adja. És most térünk rá az esettanulmányra. A 7 bölcsmester története nálunk és más nemzeteknél. A továbbiakban tehát erre a népszerű kora-újkori olvasmányra pillantunk rá, számításba véve a magyar művek helyét a nemzetközi terepen is. A feltételezhetően perzsa, más elméletek szerint éppen szanszkrit eredetű ponciánus narratíva igen komplikált európai, kéziratos és majd nyomtatott szöveghagyománya a középkorig vezethető vissza. Ennek részletezésébe itt nem megyünk bele, csak annyit mondunk el, hogy az Európában leginkább elterjedt latin verzió, amelyből a népnyelvi fordítások is tovább ágaztak, a 14. század első feléből való. Nyomtatott népnyelvi változatai között az első német az 1470-es évekből van, amelyet aztán 1500-ig további 15, 1600-ig 30 követett, tehát igen népszerű művel állunk szemben. Gyors terjedés figyelhető meg a 15. század derekától kezdve a hollandoknál, lassúbb viszont az Ibériai félszigeten és a Brit-szigeteken. Közép- és Észak-Európában valamivel később kezdődött a népszerűsége, a magyar mellett a lengyel és cseh, valamint a dán és svéd fordítások is csak a 16. században készültek el. Fennmaradt középkori latin variánsai közül 2-nek van magyar vonatkozása. Egyiket ma a gyulafehérvári Batthyáneum, a másikat a budapesti egyetemi könyvtár őrzi. Látható, hogy a Batthyáneum béli az igen rossz állapotban van, a budapesti az olvasható, meg az magyar földön keletkezett, az egy aranyos kis részlet, hogy a latin szövegnek valahol a vége felé megjelenik egy ilyen megjegyzés, hogy ihatnám. De ez magyarul. 2 16. századi magyar fordítása közel egyidős, ám egymástól független, fordítói szemléletük is eltér egymástól. Az egyiket a Kolozsvárott működött Heltai Gáspár készítette, a Bécsben megjelent másiknak nem ismerjük a szerzőjét, igen, Heltai német, az ismeretlen fordító viszont latin forrásműből dolgozott. Mielőtt tovább mennénk, idézzük fel röviden a műnek a cselekményét. Ponciánus római császárnak igen szép felesége, és az alattvalók által igen kedvelt fia van, akinek neve Diokleciánus. A császárné ifjan meghal, az özvegy császár újraházasodik, fiát pedig 7 bölcsmesterre bízza, akik távol a szülői háztól 7 éven át tanítják őt a 7 szabadmesterségre. A mostoha anya kérésének engedve a császár hazahívatja a császárfit. A mesterek azt találják a csillagoknak forgásából, ez idézett az egyik magyar fordításból, hogy halálos veszély a hazamenetel. Az ifjú azonban a csillagok járásából kifürkészi, hogy nem fog meghalni, ha 7 napon át megtartóztatja magát a beszédtől. Hazaérkezve tehát apja és az udvari nép legnagyobb megrökönyödésére nem szólal meg. A császárné a hálószobájába viteti az ifjút, szerelmi együttlétre próbálja rábírni, mikor pedig nem jár sikerrel, azzal vádolja őt a császárnál, a fiatalember életét követelve, hogy az erőszakot akart volna elkövetni rajta. A császár septében ki is mondja a halálos ítéletet, ám a vesztélyhely felé vezető úton szembe találkoznak az első mesterrel, aki elmond egy példázatos történetet a császár színe előtt, amivel egy időre sikerül megmentenie a császárfi életét. Ponciánus arra a napra felfüggeszti az ítélet végrehajtását. A hírre a császárné szintén mesével válaszol. Ennek eredménye az ítélet végrehajtás újbóli elrendelése. Ezt a második mester közbenjárására és példázatának hatására ismét felfüggeszti a császár, majd a császárné következő meséje nyomán újra a vesztőhelyre küldi az ifjút. Az ítélet kimondása és felfüggesztése szerint a ritmus és rítus szerint 7 napon át ismétlődik, vagyis egymást váltva hangzik el 7 történet a császárné és a mesterek szájából. A 8. napon végül itt elírtam, elnézést, tehát on the 8th day, not on the 7th. A 8. napon végre Diokleciánus is megszólalhat, leleplezi a család császárnét és női ruhába öltözött szeretőjét, majd elmondja a mű egészének szerkezetében 15., ugyancsak példázat funkciójú és a saját sorsát fikcionalizáló történetét. A végkifejlett derülátó és egyértelmű, küzdelmek és veszélyek után kiderül az igazság, a jó elnyeri jutalmát, a gonoszt pedig példásan megbüntetik. Keretes elbeszélésként, ahol ráadásul az élet megtartása vagy elvesztése a történetmondás tétje, és itt hozzá lehet kapcsolni a műveltségünk meg annyi keretes történetéhez ezt a művet, ez a mű több, mint puszta novellagyűjtemény. Bírósági tárgyalásra emlékeztető, rituális elemeket sem nélkülöző, jól strukturált architektúrája révén értelmezések és hangsúlyok sokasága részére nyitja meg az utat. Amikor korábban foglalkoztam a kérdéssel, csak úgy felfigyeltem rá futólag, hogy a szakirodalomban a 7 bölcsmester címmel és annak változataival emlegetik a művet nemzetközi szinten, és hogy a latin meg a német edíciók is ekként szerepelnek. Aztán később megtudtam, a magyar pedig Ponciánus császárként, történeteként. Később megtudtam, hogy a 2 magyar és egy 1540-es lengyel, valamint egy 1590-es dán változaton kívül, amelyek a 7+1 napon át a meséket meghallgató császárt teszik meg címszereplővé, minden más edíció címe a mestereket helyezi előtérbe. Az viszont minden nyelven közös, hogy históriáról, ritkábban krónikáról beszélnek, ami annyival azt jelenti, hogy lőtt dolog, tehát valami, ami megtörtént, és ezért el kell hinni. A fikciós jelleget egyetlen terminussal némiképpen felfüggesztő gesztus a hitelesként, azaz megtörténtként való elfogadás felé igyekszik terelni a befogadó figyelmét. Akárcsak a szépség. Mindaz, ami olvasásra kommendálja magát, ilyenként teszi nem csak a magyar, hanem a német, lengyel vagy holland címlapokon is. Persze szép a hasznossal kapcsolódik össze. A német bölcsek szép hasonlatairól beszél, vagy a német szöveg a bölcsek szép hasonlatairól beszél, schöne Gleichnisse, meg arról, hogy az olvasnivaló a hamisság hírnökei ellenében vicces, meg vidám is, sehr lustig und nützlich. És ugyanennek a kifejezésnek a mását találjuk a mi bécsi kiadásunk címlapján is, ez szerint a 7 bölcsmesterek mondásit csudaszép hasonlatosságával foglalván hozza előnkbe a történet. Érdemes még néhány gondolat erejéig visszatérni a címadás által generált hangsúlyokhoz. Mindig az a fontosabb aktor, akit a cím azzá tesz. A címszereplő kapcsán pedig eltérő természetű problémák kerülnek előtérbe. Ha a bölcsmesterek emelődnek ki, akkor az ő és persze a császárné történeteik és azok ereje a fontosabb. Tudnak menteni vagy halálra ítélni. A mesék, mint szép hasonlatosságok exemplum funkciójára, példa jellegére kerül a nagyobb nyomaték, arra, ahogyan ezek az érvelés részévé válnak és alkalmazásra kerülnek. Beispiel a németben, example az angolban, hasonlatosság a mi bécsi edíciónkban, példa a heltai félében. Nála alkalmanként jelzőkkel ellátva, álnakságos, ha a császárné mesél, példabeszéd, ha valamelyik mester. A szövegben vannak is a történetek értelmezésére és applikációjára vonatkozó utalások, a továbbiakban csak a heltai féléből idézek egyet vagy kettőt. Megértette felséged az én beszédemet? Jól megértettem, feleli a császár. És e példához képest meg nem öletem az én fiamat ma. A mesterek meséinek tanulsága nem kerül részletes kifejtésre, elegendő a megértéstől megbizonyosodni. A császárné történetei már hosszabb, mondhatni szájbarágósabb magyarázatot kapnak. Jön egy újabb idézet. Felséges uram, eszedbe vetted beszédemet hova mégyen? Felele az császár, jól vettem eszembe. És mondta a császárné, igen, félek, hogy felségednek szinte úgy lészen dolga azt te fiaddal, mint ennek az nemes vitéznek lőtt az ő fiával. Igen, vagyon felséged érötte, hogy megoltalmazzad fiadat szégyentől. Szinte, mint az nemes vitéz, ki inkább meg akar halni, hogy nem, mint az fia szégyent vallana. De félek, hogy végre gonoszul füzet felségednek, szinte mint ez füzetett az ő atyjának. Talán azt is mondhatjuk, itt az exemplum retorikai funkciója kap nyomatékot, ami a betét történetek jelentőségére irányítja a figyelmet. Az olvasásmódot tekintve pedig a megszakított olvasásra és a memorizálásra kínált lehetőség. Másfelől, ha Ponciánus a címszereplő, az, amellett, hogy kiemeli a kerettörténet fontosságát, a császár személyének és szerepeinek, szerepkonfliktusainak, a döntés lehetetlenségének és kényszerűségének dilemmáira világít rá. A császár reflektál is a helyzetre, válaszolva a császárné szemrehányásaira, amiért ismételten elhalasztgatja a császárfi kivégzését, határozottságot mutat, és a törvényre hivatkozik. Nem is akarnék törvénytelenül cselködni. Tegnap hallottam egy példabeszédet, és az miatt halasztottam el az törvényt. Később kapitulálni látszik, maga is beismeri tehetetlenségét. Bizony nem tudok mit művelni. Azon vesződöl minden nap velem, hogy fiamat megölessem. Az bölcsmesterek pedig arra visznek tanácsokkal, hogy ne ölessem meg. Nem tudom, mit műveljek. Az kegyes olvasónak köszönetet, azaz köszöntést mondó könyvnyomtató, vagyis a kiadói előszó a heltai féle változatban tematizálja a 7 napon át tartó döntésképtelenséget, mégpedig negatív színben tüntetve fel azt. Igaz, Ponciánus gondosságáról is van néhány dicsérő szava, tehát hogy gondoskodik az utódlásról. Ezt érdemes hosszabban is idézni. Igen, itt vannak a szép dolgok, és a hitván dolog pedig ez Ponciánus császárban, hogy oly igen álhatatlan, és az ítéletben olyan igen hajlandozó, mint az tekenőbeli víz. mert először szereti és böcsüli az ő előbeli jámbor feleségét, és annak testamentumát dicséri és enged annak, hogy meghal, igen bánkódik rajta, és erősen gyászolja azt. Mást vévén mindjárt az elsőről elfeledközik, és testamentumát hátrahagyja. Úgy kötelezi pedig magát az új menyecskéhez, hogy az ugyan féket vet fejébe és zabolát szájába, és tétova hajtogatja, mint egy barmot, hitván, hamis és égtelen dolgokra. Lehetséges, hogy a mai elemző műfaji tudatossága nem egyezik teljesen, vagy akár egyáltalán a koraújkorival. Ezt legkönnyebben a szöveg tagolásán ellenőrizhetjük. Filológiai akríbia nélkül összenéztem egy-egy német, angol edíciót, valamint a magyar bécsi és a két heltai féle, illetve több heltai féle kiadást. Valamennyi kiadvány fejezetekre tagolja a kerettörténetet, ezzel kissé, mintha el is homályosítaná a keretjelleget, olykor, mint például heltai, meg is számozza és részeknek nevezi el annak egyes mozzanatait. Akkurátus, megszámozott alcímek vezetik be a bölcsek és a császárné meséit, a magyar bécsi, a német és az angol kötetben. Ez utóbbiban még a császárné által előadott értelmezés is kap egy külön címet, The Declaration of the Example. A heltai féle edíciókban a mesterek történetei jelennek meg, alcímekkel, a császárné meséi kiemelés nélkül a szövegbe illeszkednek. A következtetések jönnek. A 16 és a 17. század magyar nyelvű irodalmának, amelynek most csak egy aprócska részletével foglalkoztunk, tetemes része fordítás. Persze a szónak koraújkori jelentésében. Magyarázat, adaptáció, átdolgozás, gyakran műfaji váltás. Ez azonban nem pusztán hazai sajátosság. Európa szerte jellemző, hogy a kor antik vagy középkori eredetű nagy slágereit ültetgetik át oda-vissza különféle népnyelvekre, köztük magyarra is, az éppen aktuális igényekhez vagy ízléshez igazítva azokat. Nem pusztán a fordítás ténye, de a munkamódszer hasonlósága is teszi, hogy nemzetközi beágyazottságról, az európai folyamatokba való betagozódásról is beszélhetünk. Ugyanakkor az egyes nyelvekre lefordított művek sosem azonosak a forrásukkal. Van, ami elvész, van, ami menet közben nyereséggé válik. Az új művek pedig a célnyelvi kultúrába integrálódva annak szerves részeivé válnak, nem véletlen, hogy a fordításokat legtöbbször szerzőkként emlegetjük és katalogizáljuk. Ezután következhetne a célnyelvi kultúrákba történő integrálódás sok-sok részletének, poénoknak, azonosságoknak, eltéréseknek a komparatív vizsgálata, ez azonban már egy másik, strapabíró bölcsész elszántságot feltételező történet. Köszönöm szépen a figyelmet. Thank you for your attention.
Dear Csilla, thank you very much for this very nice historical perspective and the lecture. So may I give you this present on behalf of the organizers and this wonderful basically medal and a note from the organizers and the president of the academy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll end up this conference on a very high note. It is my pleasure to introduce Albert-László Barabási, who needs no introduction. He is certainly one of the leading experts of network research in the world. But he is representing the physical sciences section of the Academy today. I'd like to mention something that is very peculiar, and I think that should make the Academy as well as the external members very proud, because Professor Barabási was elected to the National Academy of Sciences last year. So was his student, Albert-László. and of course Kati Karikó was also. So 3 new members of the National Academy of Sciences from amongst us. So it's an absolute pleasure, and let's give them a round of applause. Please.
Oh, this is it. This is the click. All right. Well, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And I did realize that I'm kind of in the physical sciences, and it was very tempting to speak about some of the work that we do in the biological space, but I decided to instead kind of appropriate to the occasion to give a little overview of why networks. Why do we care about it, and what has happened really in the last kind of 2 decades? And the why actually has many, many answers to that. And one of the reasons we care about networks is because many systems that we deeply care about in science are really organized in a network fashion, right? I don't have to convince anybody in this audience, and you've already heard that the brain is a network of neurons that we know since Ramon Cajal, but it's only recently we actually started to see its full 3-dimensional structure. So if we want to think about consciousness, if we want to think about any aspects of brain behavior, at the end we have to engage with the network. But also information is really organized as a network. We kind of perceive it as such, we store it as such. What you see here is actually the structure of the World Wide Web, one of the first big integrated informational systems, and you can kind of see its network structure. But so is the infrastructure that supports communication and information access. This is the internet, and of course, we tend to think that the internet and the World Wide Web are the same animal, but they are not. The World Wide Web is an informational network. The internet is a physical network of routers being connected by cables and so on. And that's what you see actually is a map of the internet about 2 decades ago. And obviously, our body, within the cells, we actually have very exquisite metabolic and protein interaction networks that really sustained our ability to be alive, right? We are not alive because we have proteins and genes. We are alive because they interact, because they work together, they achieve functions through these interactions. And so the big question was really kind of how do we conceptualize these networks? When you look at this, and what you see in front of you really is the protein-protein interaction within the human cell. And, you know, it does look like not by accident like, like the galaxies out there. And the question is, how do we mathematically describe these networks? How do we extract the organizing principles? How do we extract the sources of non-randomness to really understand them? And to do so, we have to go back in history and first talk about randomness. And very appropriately, we have to talk about the work of 2 Hungarian giants in mathematics, Paul Erdős and Alfred Rényi. None of them require introduction in this particular context. They have done many, many important things in mathematics, but what matters here today for me and for our community is that they were the first to start studying systematically using the tools of graph theory and combinatorics, the concept of a random network. Why random network? Actually, they published about 8 papers on the subject, and the very first one, they bothered to actually give a 2-sentence motivation of why they care about networks. And they did mention actually transportation and biological networks, but fundamentally, the networks that are out there look so complicated, so stochastic, that the first instinct, rightly so, is to assume they're random. And what does it mean if a network is random? Then you draw a network using a dice. You start with a set of nodes, and you randomly connect them with a certain probability. And that was really what we call today the Erdős and Rényi model, introduced in 1959. And that model has a number of properties. Interestingly, you would think that randomness means unpredictability. For a scientist's perspective, actually, randomness is predictable, has features that you can actually calculate and analyze and so on. And one of the key feature, actually, let me just go to that. One of the key feature of that is is that when you look at the degree distribution, that is how many links each node would have, if you take all the nodes in the network and count how many, one has 10, the other one has 1, and so on, the distribution of that would actually follow a Poisson distribution. So randomness has a very clear signature, this Poisson distribution. Now, Erdős and Rényi were not the first to think about networks. There was a long tradition in sociology, particularly thinking about networks, and also in some other areas. But what we kind of realized in the hindsight that all models of networks that existed up to that moment were fundamentally versions of the Erdős and Rényi model. They were kind of inherently random network models. And so my journey in this actually started around, originally in 1994, but actually a breakthrough in 1999, where as a physicist, I wanted to figure out how well does this model describe real networks. And not as much actually, I didn't question the validity of the model, but I wanted to actually characterize real networks using this particular model. And in order to do so, we actually started with an experimental process where we mapped out a very large network. At that time, not as large as the World Wide Web. We're talking about 1999, right? The World Wide Web was about 8 years old at that time. And we effectively wrote a search engine, which is a code that starts from every page and says how many links it has, and it goes to those pages and collects the links and so on. So the nodes are documents and the links are the URLs. And the earlier I showed you this map, that was the map that we actually produced at that time. Why did we do that? Well, we said the way we put links on our web pages looks random. I don't know, somebody has a motivation to put something about medieval literature. Other people would put about RNA vaccines and so on, right? So everybody has actually their personal motivation of what links they put on their web page. So that should be unpredictable and random, and hence we would expect the degree distribution of the World Wide Web to follow a Poisson distribution. That is that the number of pages that have 1, 2, or so on follows this very clear shape. And we were the most surprised when we did not find that, right? We wanted to measure the distribution because we wanted its parameters so then we can characterize the web. And to our surprise, what we found was something fundamentally different. We found what we call a power law distribution. This is what you actually see over here on the bottom. You see a log-log scale, and you see effectively the probability that the randomly chosen web page will have exactly k links, or simply the number of pages with k links versus k. And the fact that on a log-log scale, the data lines up along the straight line indicates that this really is a power law and not a Poisson distribution. And of course, you would say that's perhaps exciting for a physicist that there's something different, but why does it matter? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But we ended up naming these networks scale-free networks because in a Poisson distribution, the average degree is very characteristic in the system. Most nodes have the same degree as the average. Here you have orders of magnitude differences in terms of degree, and hence there is no intrinsic scale, and it's also a term that is really being used in statistical physics in phase transitions when it comes to power law distributions. I'll tell you more about that, of where the name comes from. But fundamentally, the question was, okay, we happen to find that the World Wide Web has this structure, but is it only the World Wide Web, and why do I care about it? Because I'm not so invested in the World Wide Web. And things became much more interesting when people started to look at other networks, and they found the same pattern. So what you see on the left-hand side is a detail from the internet, right? So again, this is an infrastructural network where cables are connecting computers together. And to our and to the author's surprise, Falutsos, and Falutsos, in a very classical 1999 paper, they found the internet also has a power law degree distribution. Then other people looked at road systems, and they found the same actually in the Nordic countries, and in other places was now recovered, and so on. And when it comes to science collaborations, actually, you find the same pattern. Now let me stop for a second and tell you how is a power law different from a Poisson. As I said, the power law really implies that there are orders of magnitude differences in terms of degree. So it's best to understand in context of science collaboration. It means that most scientists collaborate with 1 or maybe 10 other scientists, But there are a few scientists who collaborate with hundreds and often thousands of other individuals. And of course, in mathematics, Erdős was probably one of the biggest hub in that sense. So the difference between a random network and a scale-free network is really the absence or the presence of the hubs. In the random network, the hubs are forbidden. Very highly connected nodes are forbidden. In a scale-free network, they are naturally there, and their number is very predictable and accurately follows a very precise law. And so we and others saw that in the science collaboration network of how many co-authors and then you have, and everybody has. And there was a really lovely paper actually that made lots of news out of Sweden, published in Nature, where they showed that the sexual network actually follows the same pattern. This is more than funny actually, because the sexual network really is responsible for the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. And as we'll see in a second, that really matters, the fact that there are hubs over there. But what is interesting about the examples that I provided you is that they are all, let's call it, human-made networks. Somehow it requires human action to create all of these networks, whether it's collaboration, World Wide Web, or so on. So raise the question, is this something that we do? Are the hubs something that we like to create, or is this something more fundamental than human actions? And the answer came actually from the study of both metabolic and protein interaction networks, networks within the cells. And we were actually first to look at, in 2000, at the metabolic networks in about 23 organisms, from bacteria to humans. And here the network is what actually sounds like that. The nodes are the chemicals, and the links are how many reactions does one particular metabolite participate in. So you find that most metabolites are very specific to the pathway which they participate, but there are a couple of metabolites like water, ATP, carbon dioxide, that act as cofactor, and they participate in a very high fraction of reactions, and they are the hubs of this system. And the same turned out to be true for the yeast-protein interaction network, where the nodes are proteins and the links correspond to binding interactions. And this was originally discovered in yeast, and once a few years later, when the human data became available, that blue network that I showed you earlier, right, then the same pattern emerged over there. And now if you put these pieces together, then a very interesting question emerged, right, which is, how is it possible that the network that we created like say over 20 years, which is the World Wide Web, has the same underlying architecture as the cell that has a 4 billion year history, right? So this is really the fundamental thing, because we tend to, if you have a biologist hat, you tend to think everything is specific. If you are a physicist, however, we're looking for universal properties. And here we're seeing a property that goes across different systems. So from a physicist's perspective, that's a universal feature, and hence it requires a common explanation. And the common explanation came to the work of Reka, Albert, my student, and myself, where we kind of realized that the random network of Erdős and Rényi has some inherent assumptions built into that does not allow us to have hubs. And once we relax those assumptions, we're able to explain the power law distribution. And let me tell you how is different a real network from the random network picture that I showed you earlier. Well, first, the random network model assumes that I have a bunch of nodes, like everybody in this room, and my role as a person who builds a network is to put links between you. Like who knows whom, right? So place the links there. However, in real systems, what we find is that the networks that we see today are the result of some kind of growth process. A few nodes kind of were originally connected, and then other nodes came into the system and connected to the pre-existing nodes. And the best way is to look at it is to look at the World Wide Web, right? Where you know, in 1999, we had only one web page, Tim Berners-Lee's first web page, and now we have trillions. And how did we get there? One node at a time. So if you want to model a network, really you have to model that growth process. That is not a static network, but it's growing through the addition of nodes. And like, for example, you start from a small network and then you add another node. But when you add another node, you have to decide where will the new node connect to. And the Erdős and Rényi recipe was that it does make that decision randomly, connect to anything. And what we realize is in real systems, there is a clear bias. That is, new nodes tend to connect to the more connected nodes. Not to the most connected one, but there's just bias towards that. This is what we call preferential attachment, which is what best way to understand in the case of the World Wide Web. You know, there are trillions of pages generally out there. Well, how many do you know personally? And what do you know personally? Well, we all know the big pages, Google, Facebook, and so on, and very few of you know my web page, right? So the more connected a page is, the more likely you will connect to it, and this is what we call preferential attachment, and the way we mathematically express that the likelihood that the node will connect to a pre-existing node is just proportional to how many links that node has to begin with. And what we showed in 1999 is that growth and preferential attachment together are sufficient and necessary to actually show the emergence of the hubs in these real systems. So here I'm showing you a little network that is growing through growth and preferential attachment, and you will see that some hubs will emerge naturally, because if one node has more links than the others, the new nodes are more likely to connect to it. Hence, it will make it grow faster, and hence will turn into a hub and will maintain its hub status forever. And indeed, if you look at this network, you will find that it has a power law degree distribution. So that's the mechanism, and what we learned in the last kind of 20 years is that in all systems where we can detect the existence of a power law or the existence of a scale-free network, there is growth and there is preferential attachment, and preferential attachment is no longer a theory. You can actually measure it. And you can, if you have a network where you have the time dependence of the network, you can detect whether there is or not preferential attachment in the system. And if it is, then typically it turns out to be close to linear, as we assumed over here. Now, the question is, why do we care, right? Fine, we found a different function than what we expected. Maybe our expectation was wrong, right? Does it really matter, the fact that these networks are different, the real networks are different from the random expectation? And then, of course, we started to learn that really the hubs fundamentally change the behavior of the system. And let me tell you mathematically, why are the scale-free networks so different? Why are the power laws different from the Poisson? Mathematically, if you measure, formally the distribution looks like that. Like pk goes like k to the minus gamma, where gamma is what we call the degree exponent. And the interesting regime is really when the gamma is between 2 and 3, which most systems, so that's where we are. Because in that regime, this distribution has a well-defined average, but the second moment is infinite. And what does that mean? That's kind of a mathematical oddity, right? Well, it means that if you take a Poisson degree distribution, or any normal distribution, right, you would say that if I randomly pick a node out from that distribution, I expect it to be the average degree plus minus the sigma of that distribution, right? So I expect it to be very close to the average with some variation. However, if that variation is infinite, it means that when I randomly pick a node, I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to get, right? I could get one of the many, many small nodes, or I could get a node that is 10 million times bigger than the small node that I could get, right? So the average is well defined. Let me give an example of the World Wide Web. The average number of links on the World Wide Web is about 4, between 4 and 5. But the variance is huge, and that explains why you can occasionally pick out Google from the distribution that had a few years ago 800 million links, right? With an average of 4, Google is possible in a power law, not possible in a Poisson distribution. And that turns out that infinity really matters, right? And this is why we call these networks scale-free networks, because there's no intrinsic scale. There's no characteristic degree that would describe the system. And let me show you how that matters, right? One of the first time when we realized this matters is that we looked at the robustness of networks. Robustness is a major issue in any areas where there's network, from brain to the cell and so on. And the question we're asking, what happens if randomly nodes break down? And here I'm showing you what happens in a scale-free network, right? Randomly nodes are breaking down. And as the network is kind of shrinking because the nodes are disappearing, you will see that something really odd happens. The network doesn't break apart. And the reason why this is odd is because there's lots of theories about how a system should break down that are typically rooted, and actually mathematically the way this looks like is that if you look horizontally, the fraction of the nodes removed, in the case for the internet, and this is what I'm showing you data-wise, then instead of the network breaking down at the critical threshold, it seems to be just shrinking and not breaking apart. The reason this is unexpected is because since the 1960s we have percolation theory telling us that if you start breaking apart a network by randomly removing nodes, there's always a critical point at which the network should break apart. And in the scale-free network, we don't have that critical point. You can remove 90% of the nodes and the remaining 10% are still together. There's extreme robustness built into the structure. And what we realized that mathematically, that is because the critical point in any network, not only scale-free network, right, has that particular form, which is 1 minus and 1 over the second moment or the first moment. And that second moment in all lattices and most networks before scale-free networks is just a number, right? However, in a scale-free network, that is converging to infinity. And if that converges to infinity, then the critical point is 1, means that you can remove all the nodes and the network still hasn't broken apart, you know, in a paradoxical way. So what we learned is that these networks are extremely robust to random failures, right? If you just randomly move the nodes, they don't break apart, but there's a price you pay for it. They are actually very fragile to attacks. If you remove the biggest node, oh, interesting. I see it here, not there. Okay. Is there a reason why? Okay, this will come back good. Yes, perfect, right. So let me go back and then show you probably this video, right? So I'm going to go in the biggest node, and then the next biggest node, and the next biggest node. And you see that after I removed like 8 or 9 nodes, the network is broken into pieces, right? And on the left, I removed 24 nodes, and the network is still together. This is what we call the Achilles heel of scale-free networks. They are very robust to random failures, but they are very fragile to attacks. And it turns out that it wasn't only robustness, right? In the sense that, that I gave you this formula for network robustness, what it takes to break apart the network, and depends on the second moment or the heterogeneity of the network. But other people started to look at epidemic processes, that what's the epidemic spreading rate, you know, the critical point at which the epidemic starts spreading, and that also depends on the second moment, which I will explain in a few slides that played a key role in the COVID epidemic, for example, and also people who care about synchronization, like in the brain, you know, where the brain cells synchronize. It turns out that all theories of synchronization, once they are placed on a scale-free network, the critical point now, or any network actually, depends on the second moment, and hence in a scale-free network, the synchronization is hugely anomalous. So what we learned in the last decades or so is that just about any process that takes place on the network, any dynamical process, is fundamentally affected by the second moment of the degree distribution, or in other words, by the structure of the network, by the presence of the hubs. Now, finally, what I would like to give you is a few stories of how do we know that we are right. And what do I mean by that, right? So we have, in the first 10 years of network science, we built lots of theoretical constructs, and we had lots of numerical and simulation evidence that everything that we built is correct, and it compared very well with empirical data. But if you're a physicist or a biologist, right, you would like to have falsifiable experiments to say, yes, what I'm doing is actually right. And so what happened in the last 10 years, however, is that those experiments became possible. So I'm going to give you a few examples of cases where really network science made a huge difference in a way that it's impacting our life, or it's experimentally testable that its predictions are really working out in the way we would like to have in physics or in biology. And let me start with the epidemics, obviously, right? At the end, so one of the things that I showed you earlier is that the critical point, that is the threshold at which a virus will start spreading in function of its spreading rate, really depends on the network structure. And that was discovered in 2001 by Alessandro Vespignani, and he perfected that methodology, and we're talking about 2009 here. In 2009, he built the first network-based prediction of epidemic spreading, And this was actually a simulation that preceded the H1N1 virus spreading. And he made a couple of very unexpected predictions that turned out to be correct once the virus actually unfolded. So when COVID actually arrived, then there was a whole system that Alex and his collaborators have developed that allowed them to simulate the spreading of COVID. And that was the reason why already in December in our institute, March was the lockdown, we actually knew that that's going to be a massive problem in the US. And that was the reason why in January we did the shopping that most of you did in March only, right? Because it was very clear for us that this is not going to be stoppable, at least with the methods that we had at that time. And today, all the epidemic modeling tools that people use for decision making are based on that theory that Ales Vespiniani developed based on networks starting from 2001 and perfected into an epidemic modeling system. But let me tell you something more in the physical sciences of kind of experimental testability. As I told you, the fundamental picture of a network breakdown is that of a phase transition. That if you remove a few nodes, it doesn't matter. But if you remove more and more, you will hit a critical point at which the network will break apart. And at that moment, what we call a second-order phase transition takes place, which is a gradual transition. It's the same phase transition when water freezes or actually the water starts boiling and so on. However, some of our colleagues actually from Israel, Shlomo Havlin and his collaborators, have started to look at interdependent network. That is, when two networks are coupled together, each of them have their own dynamical processes, but they're not independent of each other. And they made, actually, in 2010, a very unexpected prediction. For coupled network, the transition is no longer second order, which is a continuous transition, but becomes a first order, which is a very abrupt transition, sorry. And the system could break itself apart very, very fast. And they made that argument, actually. They showed that when you look at the coupling of the internet and the power grid, which depend on each other because you use internet now to control the power grid, and of course you need power to run the internet, right? Then you expect to have that first order transition, and that's why we have these massive failures occasionally down the world. It's not a continuous transition, but it's a very sudden transition that is expected in that case. Once again, it was a theory that matched the empirics, but a few years ago, actually 2 years ago, they have managed to build an experimental realization of that to using Josephson junctions, a network of Josephson junctions, where if it's just one layer of a network, right, then there was a theory from the 70s that we expect a second order phase transition, and they showed, however, that if you couple a second layer to it, and they are coupled to the heat generated by the links, then the transition should become first order. And this was possible to test experimentally. The system was built, and indeed, when they looked at single layers for each of the layers, there was a second order phase transition. Once they coupled the two layers, then the transition became first order. And this is just one of the many predictions that came out from the network framework that was experimentally tested in this Nature Physics paper. So that's a physical manifestation of the system. In my lab, we work today a lot on network materials. Why? Because nature has given us materials that are mostly crystalline or amorphous systems. And they're from a network science perspective, I'm sad to say they're very boring. Right? And the question we started to ask in the last few years, 3D printing allows us to build any network we want to build. So what kind of materials would you like to build to have very interesting properties, right? If you have the freedom to do anything you want and you're not constrained by physics. And so we actually designed a material, and to show you why is that interesting, let me first show you what happens if you take a square lattice and you start actually putting it under pressure, and it will inevitably buckle in a way that layer by layer will fail. Because once one link fails, the whole layer fails, and then the next layer, and so on. However, using principles coming from network science that are not present normally in materials, we build this material that we call scale-rich because it doesn't have a characteristic scale, neither in the length of the links, nor in the thickness of the links, nor in terms of degree, how many links does one line connect to. And when you compress this, however, it doesn't buckle any longer because now the stress is distributed only locally in the system. So now we're working with our colleagues at MIT who did the experiments to try to understand what are the interesting properties of this material that we actually called, a scale-rich material that, and I'll show you again because it's a, oops, no, I couldn't show you again. Let me try it again. Here. No, it doesn't show. Anyway, what are the unexpected properties of this system? And the last example I would like to show you comes, since we have a number of brain scientists here, comes from brain science, right? And this is really rooted in a fundamental journey that we had in my lab many years ago, where we ask, okay, we now have networks, but how could you control one? How could you control the behavior of a network? And well, controlling the behavior of the network requires us not only to talk about structure, but also dynamics. Something happens on the network. And typically, the way to think about it is that you have a little network with a few nodes, and you have some signal. Either these are neurons that are sending signals to each other, and it's their state, or it's traffic on the road, or whatever you would like to have it. And so you have to have an equation to describe how that signal spread. And control theory has developed a framework to ask, really, whether I can control a network. And what does it mean of controlling a network? It means that I have a chance to input signals, like those little wavy lines on the blue lines on the right-hand side. And will I be able to choose my signals such that I can set the behavior of the other nodes the way I want them to behave, right? So obviously, if I control every single node, then I have no problem, right? But if I only control a subset of the nodes, could I control the rest of the system? And that's a well-defined control theory problem that was originally posed by Rudolf Kalman, the member of this academy, another Hungarian who really was the creator of control theory. And he mathematically showed that whether a network can be controlled, he didn't call it a network, it's a systems theory approach, what he had, but in a network language would correspond to is what it depends on the structure of the network, which is who is connected to who, which is the matrix A, as well as where you are sending the signal in. So the combination of the network structure and the position where you are sending the signal in would tell you whether the system is controllable. The problem with his theory was that he didn't tell us where should we actually send the signal in order to control the system. He just told us that if we have a guess, this equation would tell us if we can control from there or not, but didn't give us a recipe to find those nodes. And so we ended up finding a recipe, thanks to the work of Laci Lovas, who just left. But I knew that he's going to leave today because he had some other engagement, because Laci Lovas actually has worked a lot in matching theory, which is a very big area in graph theory. And matching is really almost like a game, right? So I give you a little network, and I'm going to ask you to color some of the nodes with the constraint that no node should actually connect no two red bonds should actually come into the same node. So one node could have one red bond going out or one red bond going in, but never two going in or going out. This matching theory has very important applications, for example, job selection. In the US, the medical schools use it to decide what students are going to get, what hospitals they're going to land with to practice. So that is a well-developed theory, and one of the things we realized is that using matching theory, we could identify what are the nodes from which you can control the rest of the system. That where do you have to send the signals in? And to be more specific, let me show an example of how that works. If you give me an arbitrary network like that, right? I would go ahead and apply matching theory, and then the matching theory would say that in this particular case, everything that is not green needs to be controlled because the green is controlled by the other nodes, and hence I have to send signals in those nodes to actually control the system. And I have many different ways to choose that, and the reason this was really an advance is because previous methods really assumed that this is an NP-complete problem, but by mapping it into matching theory, we were able to show that really this has a polynomial algorithms because computer scientists have already provided very polynomial algorithms for that. Why is this important? One is actually we have a recipe to identify how you control an arbitrary network with an arbitrary dynamics on it. But most important, we were able to use that to understand what are the neurons responsible for locomotion in the brain, in this case of the C. elegans. Why C. elegans is the only brain that is fully mapped out, or at least a few years ago that was it. Now we have Drosophila as well. And biologists or neuroscientists have actually shown us there's a very well-defined pathway through which the sensory neurons on the body of the C. elegans transmit information to the muscles and control the muscle motion. And these are the neurons involved in that process. That's the schematic diagram that you get typically in biology books. What is interesting about this is that if you actually look at the network, then that's how this network looks like. And those nodes that are highlighted are those were in the previous one. So it's not, you don't see a nice pathway, right? The same neurons are connected to dozens of other neurons independent of that pathway. So the question is, could we really predict from this really dense, messy network, which is the reality, what neurons are involved in locomotion? And we had something to train our thinking of, and actually we ended up doing that. We asked, what are the neurons that are necessary for controlling based on network control principles? And the theory ended up predicting all the 12 classes of neurons that 30 years of experimentation has discovered, but it also predicted one more, which is the PDB that was not known to be involved. And then our colleagues actually at Cambridge University in England ended up experimentally testing, and that turned out to be experimentally correct. So fundamentally, this was again a prediction that kind of brought in a neuron that was never thought to be involved in locomotion and could be experimentally tested and falsified, and it did work out. So I will end actually the use of network science with two very recent examples. One of them, obviously, from the COVID, we can use network science, and that's the concept of network medicine, where we're using to predict, drug repurposing opportunities. And during COVID, we had the opportunity to use this methodology to predict what drugs were actually involved, could kill actually the infected cells. And of course, Katalin's work ended up solving the problem at that moment. But before we actually knew, or we believed that there's possible to have a vaccine at such a short time frame as Katalin has managed to provide us, the expectations from doctors was that we need existing drugs to be repurposed for that purpose. And we ended up predicting and experimentally testing all the drugs on the market and about 6,000 drugs against COVID. And luckily, we didn't need it because we had vaccines. And now, actually, in the US, if you are RA patients, rheumatoid arthritis, you will actually get network-based tools, blood tests that would tell you whether Humira, which is the leading drug, will work for me. For full disclosure, it's provided by a company that I helped fund, but now every month, many thousands of patients are using this tool to decide what drugs they should take and so on. So with that, I will end with this very simple picture, right, of why do we care about structure and why do we care about networks? And I like to use this picture because we have here two materials. One is a very soft and malleable, which is graphite. And the other one is diamond, which is one of the strongest material on Earth. And what's the difference between them? It's exactly the same atoms. The difference in the network, right? And in many ways, what we learned in the last 20 years is that no matter what area of science you look at, if you look from linguistics to biology to neuroscience, the network really defines the behavior of the system. And hence, we must map it out and we must understand its systems. We know the structure defines robustness, spreading properties, controllability, resilience, and many, many other features. So therefore, if you want to understand a complex system like a brain or the cell or ecological systems and so on, without addressing the network problem, you cannot get to step 2. And that's where our mission is in network science, is to provide the tools to all of these disciplines to be able to make progress in their area by being able to understand their networks. And thank you very much for your attention.
It is my privilege to present you this certificate.
Thank you so much.
On behalf of your academy and the organizer, and a little gift in recognition of your contributions.
And thank you for making this possible.
Our pleasure. Well, all is well if it ends well, and it certainly ended very well. And I owe a big thank you to all of you who attended the conference, who worked very hard to make this work as seamlessly as it has. And I think that this conference certainly is a way reinforcing the notion with which the Academy was established, and we have the intellectual wherewithal and excellence for the next 200 years. With this, the conference is closed. Thank you.
So, Gábor, thank you very much for the organization, and here is the Emlék Club.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.